Hi, everyone. I'm just going to give people a few more minutes to join us, actually a few more seconds rather than minutes. Hope that all of you joining us have had a good weekend, a good week so far. We're certainly turning a corner on this pandemic, so things are looking up for us. So thank you for joining us this morning, everyone. I'm so glad that we've been able to do this series, Talking Stories, since last year, since the pandemic began. And of course, the purpose for doing these interviews is to give people in communities of color an opportunity to lift their voices, and particularly to share their stories and to talk about their passions, and especially about issues of social justice and racial justice. And this morning, I am so thankful and I'm so glad. I feel so honored and privileged to be able to share with you this morning our platform with Dr. Satsuki Ina. Dr. Ina is not much older than myself, but I look up to her, having read some of her story and learning more about her, and I'm so glad that she's been able to join us. Dr. Ina has been very involved in our Japanese American community and other communities as well. She is Professor Emeritus in the School of Education at the California State University in Sacramento, and she has produced 2 award-winning documentary films which were broadcast on PBS, Children of the Camps, and the second film, From a Silk Cocoon, and you can stream both of those films on Amazon. She currently is a psychotherapist. She has a psychotherapy practice in San Francisco, and she specializes in collective trauma, which she'll be speaking about later this morning. She has a book coming out, Be Strong, Don't Cry, and it'll be published by Heyday Press, Berkeley in 2022, so just around the corner. She is the co-founder of Tsuru For Solidarity, which is a nonviolent direct action project of the Japanese American social justice advocates who are working to end detention sites and support frontline immigration and refugee communities that are being targeted by racist, inhumane immigration policies. So Dr. Ina, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Reverend Chinen. Appreciate you having me.
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, we are turning the corner on this pandemic. But it certainly has been a challenging year for all of us. So I want to begin by asking you a question that I ask all of my guests on this program. How's your spirit? How are you doing these days?
I think it's an important question. I was telling my friend the other day that I feel like I've been kind of crinkled during the pandemic. I mean, managing day by day, living with the limitations and things like that. And coming back doesn't feel like just a smooth transition. I feel like I'm uncrinkling all the ways I had kind of cramped and shut down parts of my expectations or my routine. So it feels good. I mean, the sun is shining and summer is approaching. People are out more, so I feel very uplifted, but cautious.
Yeah.
Cautious.
I know people tend to say, "Oh, we're coming back to normal," but really, I don't think there's anything normal to come back to. Things have changed so much, but. So I feel like, myself, that we're closing a chapter and beginning a new chapter. So there's always hope for us. So Dr. Ina, I know that your family was wrongfully incarcerated in 1942 as a result of Franklin Roosevelt's signing of the Executive Order 9066, which resulted in the unconstitutional arrest of, I think, nearly 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry. And you were actually born in the Tule Lake Segregation Center, Northern California. So I know we would love to hear you share about that experience of being incarcerated, how that impacted you, your family, and of course, the larger Japanese American community.
Happy to. I'm going to try to screen share some photos, and I'll just quickly go through. I think I have 5 quick photos, and then we can talk in more detail, but it might give people context. Let's see if I can just do it this way, see if it works. Does that work?
No, we're not seeing anything yet.
Okay, so what I have to do is put it on my screen first. Let's see. I have to make you tiny. Okay, does that show?
No. Actually,
No,
if you just went to the share screen, you don't have to make us minimized. You can just go to the share screen on the Zoom link.
okay, all right, let's see. So share screen.
And you should see some of the photos up on. There you go.
There you go. So this is March 1942. My mother is standing in line. This is a photo taken by Dorothea Lange, a very renowned photographer that was hired by the War Relocation Authority to document the removal of the Japanese Americans. So she was living in San Francisco in Japantown. It's become an iconic photo now in the Library of Congress, along with Dorothea Lange's other photographs. But this one in particular, because it has the 2 posters in the back. These were the posters that were posted on the walls and the telephone poles in all the Japanese American communities, notifying people that they had, a day or 2 to pack up their things and be ready to be removed. And this is a line out in front of Kimon-ha, which was a Japanese language school in San Francisco, Japantown.
How old was your mother at the time?
She was 23.
Oh my.
She's pregnant with my older brother,
Mm.
and had been just married a year before, and clearly, it's always interesting to me how the men and women got so nicely dressed with their hats and their ties to get in line to be registered. And what they're registering for is to pick up their family number. So once incarcerated, the family numbers were hung on their clothing when they were boarding the buses and trains to be removed. And that was the family number that would be used in place of their names on these official documents.
Mm. Did you actually go to one of the assembly centers first? One of the racetracks?
My parents, my pregnant mother and my father were sent to Tanforan Racetrack, which is just in South San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see.
You may have, there you go.
Okay, let's see if I could get the other photos. Okay. Can you see that one?
No.
No, okay, so I have to go back and do screen share again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not very good at this.
Okay.
So I have to.
If you just go to the screen share, you should see, and click on that, you should see the photos if they're open on your.
Okay, do I open them all at one time on my screen? No, one at a time, right?
You could open one at a time.
Okay, so now let's see if this works. No. Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
So I'll just try one more thing here.
Okay.
If it doesn't work, we'll just go to our conversation.
Okay. Was your father somewhere else in the line at the time? In that first photo that you showed us?
No, he was removed with us, and then he was, yeah. Okay, I don't know. Devin, can you tell me anything about how to get it on?
I mean, without being able to see your screen, I can't help much.
Can't know much.
Other
Okay.
than what Gerald said is just having the images open and then selecting screen share and zoom. You should be able to pick from the open images.
I have the image on my desktop.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
So if it's open on your desktop, if you just go to the share screen and click on share screen, you should be able to see those images. And then you just pick the one that you want to share.
okay, but how do I get it on the share screen face? There it is. There's one. Okay. Can I put them all on there? Let's see. No. Okay, I'll just, so,
There you go.
okay, so this is a photo of so they were removed, went to Tanforan Racetrack, and then sent to Topaz, Utah, where my brother was born. And in 1943, my parents were asked to sign a loyalty questionnaire. And my father was, my mother and father were very reluctant to sign a loyalty questionnaire until they were freed, till their constitutional rights were granted to them. They're American citizens, and without any due process, they were incarcerated. So my father was identified as a dissident and a troublemaker. So he was taken from from our barracks and put inside this jail that was built inside of the jail of Tule Lake. So this is my father here in the white t-shirt. And you could see the jail had 4 beds, 1, 2, and there's 2 more on this side. But this photo was at the Smithsonian in a photo exhibit. And I came across it inadvertently. Okay, screen share. This is to give you a sense. This is just a small collection of the children. This is the image I use for my film, Children of the Camps. This is the Buddhist Church Sunday School photo.
Oh my.
And very rare to get all these, one photo of so many children. And as a psychotherapist, I often look closely at photographs of children, expressions on their faces. Right on the right-hand corner is my mother standing, carrying my brother. But so more than half of the people who were incarcerated were children.
This is the first time I've ever seen a photo of just the children.
Right. And so, the basis for our incarceration was that we were a risk to national security. So the work that I've done, many years later, were with these children of the camps as adults, many, many years later, how they coped with experience, what happened to them, how they feel today about their incarceration. And it was an experience of collective community trauma and also intergenerational trauma. See, and then there's one last photo here. So we were separated for almost 2 years when my father was sent. Can you see that one?
We can just see the top of their heads.
Okay, I'll move it up.
There we go.
So my father was separated from us, sent to Fort Lincoln, Bismarck, North Dakota as an enemy alien because my parents finally at some point felt that there was going to be no life for them and the children in the United States. So they renounced their American citizenship with hopes to go to Japan. They're both American citizens, but had spent some of their youth in Japan and still had family there, and felt that if they renounced that, rather than staying in an interminable sentence with no definite ending, that they would sign up by going back to Japan. So my father was returned to us, and we were being prepared to be deported to Japan. And this photo always struck me because it's a picture of us being reunified. But if you look at my face and my brother's face, you will see that, you know, there is a story in there. So they were held for a total of 4.5 years. And finally released and went on to Cincinnati, Ohio for a while, and then eventually returned to San Francisco.
And actually, your parents ended up staying in the States.
Yes, because this is a great question, because ACLU got involved with the whole renunciation. There were about 6,000 people who felt the same way, felt hopeless and despairing, and thought that if they renounced their American citizenship, they could be deported to or expatriated to Japan. And then Japan, of course, lost the war, and families in Japan were telling their relatives in the US, don't come because there's no food, there's no housing, we can't take care of you. And so in the meantime, ACLU's attorney, Wayne Collins, who later had to disconnect from the ACLU to pursue this because National ACLU didn't want this case to be brought to court. And the case was that everybody who renounced their citizenship did so under duress because they were incarcerated at the time. So that the legislation that was passed to actually encourage renunciation, because the War Relocation Authority were anxious to get rid of as many Japanese in the United States as they could. And in the end, Wayne Collins was able to stop the deportation process. But when you renounced, you gave up you had to turn in your written certification of your citizenship along with your birth certificate. And so in 1959, after 20 years of effort on Wayne Collins' part, my parents got a letter saying that their US citizenship was returned because renunciation was deemed null and void as a result of duress.
And so going back to the original question about the impact on your family, as well as in the Japanese American community, I know that it's been a long-lasting kind of thing, but could you talk a little bit more about the kind of impact it's had, that the camp experience has had on the Japanese American community?
Sure. I think for many years, people lived in pretty much a constant state of anxiety, feeling that because they had never done anything, there was never any case that was brought against anyone committing sabotage or fifth column activity. It created this level of anxiety in the community. So people felt that if they weren't 110% American citizens, showing that by not complaining, turning the other cheek when they were dealt with overt acts of racism and even subtle acts of racism, they never complained. If they didn't get a promotion, they didn't challenge anything that they at some level knew was related to the fact that they were Japanese. So I would say that there was this culture that emerged of anxiety, and children pick that up. So even in the next generation, there was this sense that if you didn't get like straight A's, there was danger. So many of my friends would say, gosh, I got all A's and a B, and my father is like so distressed that I got a B. And in many ways, being good employees, never complaining, working hard, doing extra, even to the point of feeling like you had to bring the best birthday present to any kid's birthday, especially if they weren't Japanese. This feeling that having to be super qualified to belong was something that laid heavily on everyone's shoulders. And it wasn't necessarily overtly expressed or consciously talked about. This is why we have to be safe. I think children felt it, observed it, maybe heard it in certain ways, but grew up living with a lot of stress about making sure that you always prove that you were the best. So the model minority myth is really a false myth. We were model minorities under duress again, for the most part, the feeling that any mistake. So tend to be extreme law and order people, afraid to challenge authority, reluctant to speak out against any kind of injustice, until redress. When Japanese Americans won redress in 1988, the Civil Liberties Act was passed, and presidential apology was granted to everybody who survived the wartime experience. Then kind of floodgates opened out, and stories, documentary films, educational programs, all kinds of ways that people felt now safe because they had been acknowledged as having been victims of racism and wartime hysteria. My mother got her $20,000 check. I was living in Sacramento and she was in San Francisco at the time. And I said, okay, did you get your check? And she said, yeah. I said, okay, I'm coming down because I want to see the money. I want to see it. So I drove down, and when I got to her apartment, I said, okay, where's the check? And there's this whole pile of papers on this desk, and buried in there, she said, oh, the check's somewhere in there, and it's buried in this pile of papers. But when I went to the desk, what I saw was the letter of apology from the president hanging on the wall, had already been framed and hung. And so I asked her, I said, what does this mean for you? And she looked at me, she had tears edging her eyes, and she said, I feel like I finally got my face back. So the $20,000 didn't mean, I mean, she was certainly not a woman of means, but the $20,000 didn't have much meaning for her. But the acknowledgement that her incarceration, her victimization, her, being targeted, had now been fully acknowledged. And because there was a lot of shame associated with, even if you're innocent, to be cast out, particularly from a culture that is very collective in nature. Belonging is a high priority in terms of values. To be cast out, even for something that you weren't responsible for, there was a tremendous amount of shame. And I think that feeling of shame, the feeling of needing to always prove yourself, got passed on to the next generation.
That reminded me your story about your mother. Then when I was serving as a pastor in San Mateo at the Japanese American congregation there, as people were beginning to receive their letters and their checks, there was an elderly gentleman. He was an older Nisei. He came knocking at the door of the church, And I could see right away when I opened the door that there were lots of emotion on his face, and I could see tears in his eyes. And he said, Reverend Chinan, I just wanted to come and show you this letter. They finally acknowledged the wrong that they did. And he didn't say anything about the check, but it was the letter of acknowledgement that was so important to him. And another experience I had with a church member was a member of the search committee who called me to serve there as their pastor. We were just having a conversation around dinner, and I asked him, well, how did you come about choosing this church? And he said, well, I wanted my children to grow up American. And by that he meant if they went to the Buddhist church, they would still be seen as outsiders, but the Presbyterian church was considered American. So, and he said, I don't even consider myself a Christian. I just want my children to be seen as American, And so the whole idea of being constant and perpetual foreigners, that was very true in my congregation. And speaking of loyalty and all that, you had mentioned earlier about the loyalty questions that your family had to answer in the camps. For those of us watching, could you explain what that was, those loyalty questions?
Yeah. If so a little bit of background is helpful. So by 1943, the US government realized that they had been taken on a huge financial burden during time of war. And they were anxious to now figure out how to remove people, how to release people back into the community that could prove that they were not a threat. Now, the rationale for suddenly and quickly removing 120,000 people from their homes was justified because Pearl Harbor had been bombed. Anybody that had the face of the enemy was what General DeWitt called a Jap is a Jap, whether they were citizens or not. So in violation of citizenship rights, whether you were an alien or what they called a non-alien, which is a citizen, you were removed. So now, realizing that in that time from 42 to 43, that there was no underground effort to sabotage the U.S. There were no incidents. There was no proof of any kind. And that was supported by the FBI and the Office of Naval Intelligence, saying that there's no sign, there's no indication. But all that information was suppressed. So the Army, the US Army also, worrying that they were not going to have enough soldiers, saw young men in the camps, in the prison camps, as a source of recruits. So the administration and the US Army got together and put together this loyalty questionnaire. And how the person answered question number 27 and 28 would determine whether they were loyal, which, when you think about it, you ask a person two questions, and if they answer one way, they're loyal. If they answer another way, they're considered disloyal. But it was kind of a speedy remedy to the dilemma that the government was faced with, because they knew that if they started releasing Japanese Americans after telling them that they were such a threat, that people would protest. Neighbors, people in the communities didn't want these dangerous people returned back to their neighborhoods. So the questionnaire was actually, in some ways, a foil, a manipulated situation to be able to draft, to get volunteers and eventually draft young men into military service, and to reduce the cost to the federal government for incarcerating so many people. So the two questions, one question was, do you forswear loyalty to the emperor and swear loyalty to the US government? And that meant people found that question very confusing, because most of them didn't even know who the emperor of Japan was, had never felt or or express any loyalty to the Emperor of Japan. And the immigrant Issei's, like my grandparents, were never permitted to become citizens. So if they answered yes, they were loyal to Japan, they would be considered disloyal. If they answered no, they would become stateless people. So they were in a bind. And and then the second question is, will you be willing to bear arms against the enemy? And this was another incredible double bind, because many of the Japanese Americans had families in Japan and were afraid that if they went to war, they would be face to face with a cousin or an uncle or something like that. And underlying all of that was the fact that they were imprisoned by their own government. And a government, many of the Issei's had been here for 30, 40, 50 years. And had made their lives there, had American-born children, never dreamed of going back to Japan. Mm-hmm. So this is where my parents, who were American citizens, had been as children sent back to Japan because of family tragedy, and then came back as young adolescents. They answered no to the loyalty questionnaire. Because one, my father was very outraged about losing his civil rights. And my mother, because she was so fearful about what was going to happen to the children in a country that hated people with Japanese faces. So 6,600 people renounced their American citizenship. Many people in Tule Lake, that was the camp with the largest number of people who answered no to the loyalty questionnaire. Those that answered yes later were subject to, if you were of age, subject to the draft. And others were released early to return, not to the West Coast, but anywhere other than the West Coast. So because the West Coast was still considered a military zone. And also there was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment there. And there was, for Japanese Americans leaving the prison camps, fear that they would be harmed if they returned. And there were serious incidents of attacks on Japanese Americans who tried to go back to the West Coast.
You know, before we go on, if any of you who are watching have any questions for Dr. Ina, you can go to the Q&A box down below and you can write your questions there. So Dr. Ina, thank you for sharing about that. I was at the post office a few days ago, and I was so happy to see that they've actually now come out with the commemorative stamp for the 442 Regimental Combat Unit, the most decorated unit during the Second World War. And so I ordered a whole bunch of those stamps. So Dr. Ina, I, after seeing your documentary, Children of the Camps, I was so moved by it. And in that particular movie, it showed that you had invited several Japanese Americans who, like you, were also either born or were children in the camps, and you invited them for a weekend retreat. And watching it, I was so struck by the depth of their individual sharing, as well as what all of that meant to their collective memory. And in watching it, I felt like I could hear and feel a lot of pain, but also a lot of empathy. Mm-hmm. And in the film, I could feel that the group process was really the genesis for some real healing. And you were able to facilitate all that so well. So as a psychotherapist, you specialize in the work of community trauma. So what exactly does community trauma mean? And especially, what does that mean for communities of color?
So thank you. Thanks for watching the film.
Yeah.
That film was made 20 years ago and still is being viewed and used in the classrooms across the country. And so, you know, it's only fairly recently that we're using terms like racism trauma, that to be a victim of racism is a form of collective trauma. If you are a person of color,
Yes.
If you are you know in any way different from the mainstream, that community suffers being stigmatized, being targeted, etc. And what happened for the Japanese Americans was, in order to survive after they were released, they had to quickly assimilate, acculturate back into mainstream society. They had to look like, you know, the white American neighbors that lived next door or in the other neighborhood. And so they suppressed their story, they suppressed their experience. Trauma is typically experienced, described in a psychotherapy perspective as an experience that overwhelms the person's coping strategies, normal coping response. So what happens is they suppress it, and it's stored. Trauma memory is stored in a different way from normal memory because the brain is designed to keep people safe. So anything that looks like or is similar to or in any way reminiscent of the original exposure to the trauma, the person has an almost automatic response, a fight, flight, or freeze response to that threat. And that's my understanding of, for example, the model minority, how a whole community could take on this, and how the media and the general public could assume that that's true for everybody. So collective trauma is a shared traumatic experience. And so what I learned over time is that then the healing experience needs to be shared. I've been a therapist for 30 years, and doing individual treatment with somebody who has suffered racism trauma wasn't as profound or as deep a healing process as when people were together sharing their stories and have each other reflect back and mirror back resonance of their experience at the deepest level. As you can see in that film, Children of the Camps, it evoked this incredible level of compassion, but also evoked fear and anger and misunderstandings of one another. So I now do very little individual therapy, but mostly work with communities of people who have been traumatized. So I've worked with churches who've experienced clergy sexual abuse, and work with so to me, the whole system has been impacted. So it's not just the individual victims. Certainly they need their therapy, but to bring the whole community together and to educate people and talk about it so that the culture starts to shift within that collective about understanding the impact and also what is needed in that particular community, which is an incredible amount of empathy and welcoming and inviting people to belong. So and repair. So often in the trauma, unless it's a natural disaster, a human produced trauma requires cross-community repair. So the Children of the Camps one is like the first level of the treatment approach. The people who were victims only feel safe with each other. And there was a moment in making this film that taught me about how once you do that, it's important to then bring in people who are viewed as perpetrator to listen, hear, engage, express their empathy, and be in an interchange. So we were in the first day of filming, and as one of the women was sharing her childhood experience of her father being taken away, I heard this kind of sniffling, and I knew that that was going to disrupt the filming. So I stopped and looked over, and there was the white camera guy. And because of this, I tried to get an all Japanese American film crew, but I couldn't do that. So here was this white camera guy who was at that time lifting these big cameras, tears flowing down his face, snot running down his mouth. And so I said, okay, let's stop for a minute here. And Stephen, come into the center of our circle and tell us what you're experiencing right now. And by that time, we were all crying. He had opened the door to his level of compassion. He is so touched by the stories. He let his heart open to our experience, and that made that material available to the other people who were children of the camps. And what Stephen said was so powerful. It was simple. He said, your experience is so painful, and I realize that your pain is also my pain. I can barely imagine what this must have been like for you as a kid. And all of us were just crying. We just had to shut the cameras off and just really let ourselves be in that present moment. And what Stephen was doing is he was demonstrating what is an important element of healing collective trauma, or maybe any kind of trauma. He was a compassionate witness. He was somebody who did not have our exact experience, but managed through his own experience to really embrace what he was hearing, to take it in as his own, let himself feel that grief instead of shielding himself from the victim and saying, you know, that's your stuff, not mine. He let it in. And in doing that, it created this level of safety. It was like, okay, he's white, he's male, he represents the forces that incarcerated us, that robbed us of our freedom. And yet that's not who he is. And so that experience informed then how I continued my work to work within the community that's been traumatized, and then move towards cross-community communication. So right now I'm in the middle of organizing Asian American community leaders with African American community leaders to be in a healing circle. Because many of the attacks on the Asian Americans have been African American perpetrators. There certainly have been many white perpetrators, but because having other perpetrators of color attacking Asian Americans is something that needs to be addressed and needs to be explored and understood. So we're organizing that now as we speak.
Well, those are really powerful stories, and that story about Stephen, I think that's an amazing story for us to all hear, because we all want to be allies to other communities, and I think certainly having very deep empathy is, and you mentioned compassionate witness. I love that phrase. It's a powerful phrase. Thank you for sharing that. I know that you really, really do have a keen and strong passion for racial and social justice. And I know in watching some of the things on YouTube and other places where I've seen you, that you really have a heart for the immigrant and refugee populations who, like the Japanese in the 40s, have had to face these forced removals and detention. And as we mentioned earlier in the introduction, you were instrumental in founding the organization Tsuru For Solidarity because of your desire to see justice for immigrants and refugees who have been detained. Could you talk to us about the significance of the symbol of the tsuru,
Mhm.
and which is the crane, and then of course the importance of your work in Tsuru for Solidarity?
Yeah. Okay, sure. So the tsuru is a crane, and the origami crane, the paper folded crane, is a symbol in Japanese culture of peace and compassion and hope. Originated from the story of Sadako after Japan had suffered the atomic bombing, and she began folding these paper cranes because there's an ancient story that if you folded 1,000 of these paper cranes, you would get your wish. And so while she was in the hospital recovering from the after effects of the atomic bomb radiation, she began folding these cranes. She died before she completed that, and then the school children across Japan heard of her story and began folding. And now in Hiroshima, there is a memorial, and people come from all over the world now bringing strands of paper cranes because it was her wish and the wish of the other children who had folded these cranes for world peace. Um, so the way I got involved is in 2015, a Japanese American attorney for the ACLU. He's a fourth generation Japanese American whose grandfather had been incarcerated at Tule Lake, where my father uh, was an ACLU attorney. He called me on the phone and he said, you know, they're opening up, this is 2015, they're opening up these detention facilities where they're going to hold mothers and children. And he said, as the ACLU attorney, he was, because they've been criticizing these privately owned, government contracted facilities. So he was, along with others, invited to view the Carnes family detention, they call it a family residential center, before the immigrants, the asylum seekers were held there, kind of like they were showing off how state of the art their facility was. And when he was talking to me, he actually broke down in tears when he said that when they opened the supply cabinet, he saw rows and rows of little shoes, anticipating that hundreds of children were going to be held here. And he said they're now filling these detention facilities, and we'd like you to come undercover with some religious visitors because they wouldn't allow any professional psychologists to go in there. But with the faith leaders that are allowed to go in there to visit with the mothers and children, we'd like to get you in. And I said, I don't speak Spanish. And they said, that's all right. We'll pair you with a priest that speaks Spanish. We'd like you to do whatever observations you can. If you can speak with the children and the mother, we'd like some kind of evaluation from your point of view about the trauma that the children are experiencing. So that's a whole nother story, but I went in and then back several times and heard first person stories. And I was, you know, what I saw was myself in these children. The fear, there's a little area there where children could go and play. There were toys and a nice carpet, but these new toys were completely untouched because the children were clinging to their mothers while the mothers sat at the visitors' tables talking to the religious people that had come to comfort them. So then fast forward to 2019, there was a group of us who had been held in Crystal City, Texas, because our fathers had been separated from us and we were being prepared to be deported back to Japan. And so we were held at Crystal City. It was called the Family Reunification Center, where we would be brought together, fathers who were in these internment camps, federal internment camps, and mothers and children who were held in the War Relocation Authority camps would be brought to Texas at Crystal City in this large facility. We would be reunited and then deported. And that's when Wayne Collins intervened. But the group of us in the San Francisco Bay Area decided it was time to have a pilgrimage to go back to Crystal City, Texas, and commemorate the endurance and the struggles and the suffering that our parents and grandparents experienced while they were in Crystal City. So we had a Buddhist and a Christian minister join us, and we went to Crystal City. And in our planning, I told them that, 40 miles east of where we were held, the same thing is happening. Mothers and children separated from their fathers, from their families, are being held unjustly. They're asylum seekers, which is completely under international law and under US law considered a legal action if they feel danger and threat to their life and well-being, that they could seek asylum into the United States. But instead, they're being incarcerated and detained for long periods of time. So everyone said, yes, we need to go there. So, and then someone said, we need to bring tsuru, paper cranes. And I said, the fence is, because I had been there, the fence is a good distance from the facility. So we need colorful cranes, and we need a way for the children to know that we're out there. One of the things that I heard from many of the children of the camps and the stories they held was that, why didn't anybody show up for us? We're disappearing from our schools, our jobs, our farms, but there was no mass protest. There were individual friends that helped people, but there was no organized effort to stop this inhumane experience that we were experiencing. So we felt that our legacy required us to stand up and make it known that people were going to protest their incarceration and that we were going to show up. So we asked our families and friends, please start folding tsuru. We will string them up. We're hoping for, I said, maybe we should at least have 1,000 cranes. And Mike Ishii, the co-founder, said, no, we need 10,000 cranes. And I said, okay, let's take 10,000 cranes. So, and then we had people ship them to this place in Texas where we could pick them up. By the time we got to Texas and to pick up the cranes, there were 30,000 paper cranes that had been mailed. So we, and I had been to a Day of Remembrance event for the Japanese Americans on February 19th, hold these events across the country, commemorating the signing of the executive order on February 19th, 1942, that put us in the prison camps. And I was in Denver giving a talk at one of those Day of Remembrance events, telling them that we were preparing to go demonstrate in Texas, besides having our pilgrimage. And I said, I had hoped we could get taiko drummers there so that the children could hear us. But in Texas, there were no Japanese American drummers. There were Caucasian taiko drummers, but none of them were willing to join us. Oh. So when I said that afterwards, this young woman came up to me. She's a fourth generation Japanese American. She said, Dr. Ina, I will make sure that there are taiko drummers at the Dilley Center. And I said, okay, how are you going to do that? She said, my family is a 3-generation taiko drummers, and we will bring others. And so they actually traveled from Denver with their drums. Wow. And showed up at the site. So we had 30,000 paper cranes hanging on these chain link barbed wire fences, just like the ones that we were incarcerated in. We had taiko drummers that beat the drums. We had Christian and Buddhist minister that gave the blessings, and we chanted and we sang. We invited Latinx members of the community and other social justice groups in the Texas area to join us. So we sang to the children. We sang Japanese children's songs. We sang Spanish children's songs as loud as we could. And I'll close with this one piece. And we had, of course, hoped to get media there so that the news, the story about how elderly Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated saw saw that what was happening to these children at the border was similar. It was an injustice. It was a betrayal to, one, imprison children, and second, to deny people their right to seek asylum in a humane way. So several TV stations came. One of them was Telemundo, the only television station they're allowed to watch inside the detention facility. So when we heard that they were coming, we contacted the ACLU attorneys, who are the only ones allowed to go into and meet with the prisoners there to help them fight their case. ACLU contacted those attorneys. So the attorneys, when they went in, passed the word on to all the mothers that they were talking to tell them to tune in at 2:00 on Saturday to see what was going on outside. So we know that they got to watch the live demonstration. So that was the beginning. And after that, we then organized formally Tsuru For Solidarity, and knew that we needed to work in solidarity with the targeted community of Latinx folks and social justice organizations. And we have since then shown up at several sites in Washington, Oklahoma, and Southern California to protest. And we take tsuru and taiko drums with us.
Wow, that is such a wonderful and terrific story. So Dr. Ina, as we're coming to a close to our hour, I just have one last question for you. Are there some ways that you might suggest to our members who are watching and who will be watching the recording as well, how we as a community can stand in solidarity with marginalized communities?
Well, I don't know if you could put it in the chat. Our website, tsuruforsolidarity.org, is a place where they could go to see the different actions we're doing and ways they could join us. I think, if you look around in your community, and maybe you have to go outside of your community, there are, racism is alive and well in this country, and cross-community work is essential. Forming allies, forming coalitions, being a compassionate witness. I'll give you a simple example. There's this surge of anti-Asian hate that's been going on, and particularly in my community in Oakland, repeated incidents of elders being attacked, being knocked down, being robbed. It has impacted us. I'm afraid. I'm very aware now when I step outside my door, because I'm a perfect target. This is hate fomented by our former president and others who have expressed a lot of anti-Asian sentiment. And it has fed into the pain and the fear that our whole country has suffered from the COVID pandemic. And so we're the scapegoats right now. We're the targets, and the actions have been mostly very cowardly, targeting vulnerable people who can't defend themselves. So I was sitting out on my back deck, and my neighbor called over from her side, and she said, "Satsuki, I know what's going on now. It must be awful for you." She's a white woman, young white woman. And she said, "I want to be your escort when you go for a walk, when you go to the grocery store. Please call me and we'll arrange a time, and I'm going to go with you. I don't want you to be out there by yourself." And that small gesture, offer, even if I never took her up on it, calmed my spirit. It said that she wasn't ignoring what was happening to me, to my community, and that she would step forward in this very private way. She didn't have to organize a big event. She didn't have to send money. She didn't even have to sign a petition. She just called over the fence and said, "I'll be there." And it was powerful. What it did for me was it opened my fear to that idea that there are people who care, people who would stand up for me. And so there are small ways and big ways. Certainly organizations that you can Google social justice organizations, supporting Black Lives Matter, supporting social justice organizers trying to protect Central American women and children who are being held in indefinite detention in the ICE detention facilities. One case that we're dealing with right now that we're helping has to do with Vietnamese refugees. So Lam Ly is actually a member of Tsuru For Solidarity. While he was in San Quentin, one of our members is an art teacher in San Quentin, and so she was educating this group of students, prisoner students, in her art class where she was teaching them one lesson on origami, talking to them about Tsuru For Solidarity. And several of those were Asian American men who said they wanted to start folding as many as they could. And they folded thousands of tsuru for our next series of events. Well, Lam was one of those men. And when he was released after 32 years of incarceration, he committed a murder when he was a youth. So he was 19 when he was first imprisoned, and then had spent 32 years in prison, was finally released on good behavior. He had really turned his life around. He had become a Christian. He had been mentored by a Vietnamese Christian minister that came to San Quentin and mentored him. And the moment he stepped out, the minister waiting for him at the gate, ICE was standing there, grabbed him, arrested him, and put him into detention as an illegal immigrant.
Oh my. Wow.
So, he fled Vietnam as a 12-year-old, caring for his 10-year-old brother, separated from their parents, because when the North Vietnamese began to invade the South, his village had been pillaged, and he had been forced by these soldiers to dig ditches for the dead bodies. And his mother was very ill and could not go with them, but she insisted that they leave. So they left, escaped by boat, went to Hong Kong, held there in a refugee camp where they suffered a lot of starvation, and then eventually got a sponsor and arrived in San Francisco and then in LA. And Lam was 12 when he left. He was 13 when he arrived in the US. Unfortunately, the sponsor was very abusive towards him. He ran away from home, lived on the streets for a year, joined a gang, and committed a crime in a gang-related conflict. But he has done his time. He's turned his life around. He's a man of God. Continues to work with Tsuru For Solidarity on our programs. And now September 8th, he's supposed to show up at the ICE Homeland Security office, told to bring a passport. They're going to deport him back to Socialist Republic of Vietnam, the same government that he escaped from. He will be targeted as a traitor for having been a refugee, could be brought in, interrogated, tortured, and disappeared. These things that are happening today. So Tsuru For Solidarity is fighting to get Governor Newsom to grant Lam a pardon as a one way to save other Vietnamese refugees from being deported back to a country that they would be viewed as traitors. So that information you could find on our website, and we have a petition. Would love for people to join the petition and participate in any way.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. And I will, I'm sorry, we're out of time. I wish we had more time. And for those of you who are watching, we'll post some of the references that Dr. Ina has referred to. Dr. Ina, thank you so much for joining us today. And I, for one, am so glad that we got to hear you. And I'm happy to make your acquaintance. And we look forward to possibly doing more of this together. So thank you so much. And those of you who are watching, stay tuned for some other interviews that we'll be doing in the fall. We'll be posting some things early in August to let you know what other interviews that are coming up for our Talking Stories series. And again, we'll be sharing with you by email some of the resources that Dr. Ina has shared with us today. So thanks for joining us. So Dr. Ina and I are going to hang on for a little bit.
You.
But
Okay.
Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you all for being here.